The smallest bobcat ever seen was too small to survive, so when the vet cradled it in her hands, she was told to let it die. But instead of putting it down, she took it home. Secretly, because that bobcat, it wasn't just weak, it was invisible, dismissed, already counted out. And the vet's son, he didn't want anything to do with it, until one midnight feeding changed everything. Soon, they weren't just trying to save a life. They were fighting a town, fighting whispers, fighting the man who could shut them down for good. All for a creature no bigger than a shoe dot. But this wasn't just about the RUNT. This was about proving that even the smallest life can shake the biggest heart. What happens when saving one tiny bobcat threatens to tear a family, a clinic, and a town? But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. The morning sunlight filtered through the dusty blinds of Ruth's veterinary clinic, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. The familiar scent of antiseptic mingled with fresh hay from the recovery stalls out back. Ruth's fingers moved methodically through the stack of intake forms on her desk, sorting emergency cases from routine check dash-ups. The peaceful morning shattered when the clinic's door flew open with a bang that made her jump. Farmer Collins's imposing figure filled the doorframe, his mud-caked boots leaving clumps of dirt on her freshly mopped floor. In his weathered hands, he clutched a battered shoebox like it contained something distasteful. "Found this behind my barn," Collins announced gruffly, striding to her desk. "Waste of everyone's time, if you ask me." Ruth set aside her papers, maintaining a professional calm despite Collins's agitated state. "Let's have a look, shall we?" When she lifted the lid, her heart caught in her throat. Curled in the corner of the box lay the smallest bobcat kitten she'd ever seen. Its fur was matted and dull, its tiny body so fragile that each shallow breath made its rib cage shudder visibly. "Mother's nowhere in sight," Collins continued, his voice hard. "Been watching for 2 days. It's nature's way, the weak don't make it." Ruth's gentle fingers probed the kitten's body, noting its severe dehydration and dangerously low body temperature. The tiny creature barely stirred at her touch. "Better to end it quick," Collins pressed. "You know I'm right, Doc." Ruth was acutely aware of the weight behind his words. Collins's farm supplied most of the hay and feed she used for her recovering patients. His influence in the community ran deep, and his goodwill helped keep her small clinic afloat. But as she watched the kitten's whiskers twitch feebly, she couldn't bring herself to agree. "I'll handle it," she said carefully, keeping her voice neutral. "You've done your part, bringing it in." Collins's boots squeaked on the floor as he shifted. "Don't waste resources on lost causes, Doc. Bad for business." He turned toward the door, muttering under his breath, "Bad enough my grandson's going soft over every injured sparrow he finds." After the door clicked shut, Ruth released a long breath. She lifted the tiny bobcat from its makeshift bed, cradling it close to her chest. For warmth, its condition was worse than any wildlife rescue she'd treated before. Severe malnutrition, possible pneumonia, and who knew what internal issues. The practical part of her mind echoed Collins's assessment. Wild animals were already difficult to rehabilitate, and this one's chances were slim at best. But as she held the fragile body, feeling its heartbeat flutter against her palm, she couldn't shake the fierce desire to try. Hours slipped by as she tended to her regular patients, vaccinating puppies, treating a horse's infected hoof, checking on Mrs. Peterson's elderly cat. But her thoughts kept returning to the bobcat kitten waiting in its box. As evening approached and the last client left, Ruth found herself gathering supplies instead of closing up. She collected formula, syringes, and heating pads, laying them out on her exam table with methodical precision. The shoebox now sat beneath her desk, and from it came the faintest of squeaks, barely audible. But determined, Ruth paused in her preparations, looking down at the box. "You're not giving up, are you?" she murmured. Her hand hovered over the phone, considering the animal control number posted on her wall. They had better facilities for wildlife, more resources. The practical choice, another tiny squeak, drifted up from the box, like a question mark. Ruth's hand dropped from the phone. She knelt beside the box, gently lifting the lid. 2 cloudy eyes blinked up at her, and despite its weakness, the kitten tried to raise its head. "All right, little one," she whispered, carefully lifting it out. "We'll try," the kitchen clock ticked. Steadily against the quiet hum of evening crickets outside, Luke slouched at the worn kitchen table. His pencil tapped an absent rhythm as he scrolled through his phone, deliberately ignoring the homework he should have started hours ago. The back door creaked open, and his mother's familiar footsteps crossed the mudroom. Luke didn't look up. Even when she appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing her clinic coat, she moved cautiously, cradling something he couldn't see. It wasn't until she set a battered shoebox on the table that Luke finally pulled out one earbud, his expression shifting from disinterest to annoyance. "What's that supposed to be?" "A rescue," Ruth answered softly, opening the lid. "Farmer Collins brought it in this morning." Luke leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Great! Another stray eating into the grocery budget." Ruth carefully lifted a tiny form from the box, a bobcat kitten so small it nearly disappeared. In her gentle hands, its fur was patchy, its eyes barely open, and every breath seemed to take enormous effort. "This little one needs help with night feedings," Ruth explained, her voice steady despite Luke's obvious resistance. "I could use your assistance." "Seriously." Luke's chair scraped against the linoleum as he stood. "Mom, we can barely keep up with the bills as it is. The electricity notice came today. It's red this time." He gestured at the stack of mail by the microwave. "And you want to waste money on something that's probably going to die anyway." Ruth didn't respond to the outburst. Instead, she reached for the bottle of formula she'd prepared, demonstrating how to hold the kitten upright. "Small drops only," she instructed, letting tiny amounts of milk fall onto its tongue. Too much at once, and it could choke. The kitten struggled to swallow its throat, working weakly. Luke watched, despite himself, noting how his mother's fingers supported its fragile head. "You're always doing this," he muttered, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Picking up lost causes, taking in things nobody else wants." Ruth continued feeding the kitten, her movements careful and practiced. "Every life matters, Luke, even the small ones." She glanced up at him, especially the small ones. "Whatever." Luke shoved his homework into his backpack. "I'm not getting up every 2 hours for some half-dead wildcat. That's your thing, not mine." He stalked out of the kitchen, leaving his mother alone with the struggling kitten. Hours later, when the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Luke padded downstairs for a glass of water. A soft, squeaking sound drew his attention to the living room. He told himself to keep walking, but his feet carried him to the doorway anyway. The shoebox sat on the coffee table, illuminated by a small desk lamp. Another weak squeak emerged, followed by the sound of tiny claws scratching cardboard. Luke hesitated, then moved closer. The bobcat kitten lay on its heating pad, barely bigger than his palm. As he watched, it lifted one paw in a feeble attempt to reach the bottle lying nearby. Its movements were uncoordinated but determined, even in its weakened state. Luke sighed heavily, glancing toward the stairs. But instead of walking away, he found himself picking up the bottle. "This is stupid," he muttered, but his hands were surprisingly steady as he lifted the tiny creature. Just as his mother had shown him, he held the kitten upright, letting drops of formula fall onto its tongue. The first few dribbled down its chin, but then it began to swallow, its throat working with visible effort. From the doorway, Ruth watched silently as her son fed the fragile animal. His shoulders were tense, but his touch was gentle, and his expression held none of its earlier anger. She didn't speak or move, knowing this moment wasn't meant for her. Instead, she quietly retreated upstairs, leaving Luke alone with the tiny life in his hands. Morning light streamed across the worn linoleum floor as Luke sat eating cereal. Dark circles under his eyes. His unfinished math homework lay forgotten after night feedings. The shoebox on the counter emitted tiny squeaks, stronger than yesterday. Luke tried focusing on breakfast, but kept glancing up at each insistent cry. Ruth entered already in her clinic clothes. She smiled at the box. "Someone's feeling more energetic this morning. Being fed every 2 hours will do that," Luke mumbled, but joined her at the counter. The bobcat kitten was still small, but moved more coordinately, batting at its blanket. Its eyes had opened wider, showing blue-gray. "It needs a name," Ruth said, preparing a bottle. "We can't keep calling it the kitten." Luke watched it struggle to stand on wobbling legs. "How about Twig?" since it's about as sturdy as one. Ruth laughed. Close. What about sprig? It means a small shoot, something growing stronger. Sprig's fine, Luke shrugged, though his eyes stayed fixed on the kitten. Ruth handed him the bottle. Your turn, you've gotten quite good. Luke accepted both with practiced care despite his reluctance. Only because you keep making me, but his touch was gentle, his voice softening when Sprig began drinking. There you go, he whispered. At the clinic, Ruth carefully checked her makeshift nursery between patients. Sprig dozed peacefully, tiny chest rising steadily. She worried what Collins might say if he discovered she'd saved the runt. He'd wanted put down. The day passed in a blur of appointments. Ruth counted minutes between feedings, praying. No one questioned her repeated disappearances. That evening, Luke sat watching Sprig attempt to crawl. Time for bed, Ruth announced, noting Luke's drooping eyes. School tomorrow. Luke nodded and climbed to his feet. At the stairs, he hesitated, then set a 2 a.m. alarm on his phone. Thank you, Ruth said softly. Just don't want to listen to it. Cry all night, Luke muttered, ears turning pink. Hours later, his alarm buzzed. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but instead went downstairs. In the soft glow of the heating pad, Luke knelt beside the shoebox. Come on, Sprig, he whispered, lifting the drowsy kitten. Stay with me. Ruth's fingers fumbled with her. Keys in the dim morning light, her third yawn in as many minutes, making it hard to find the right one. The clinic's front door finally swung open, bringing with it the familiar mix of antiseptic and hay. Her movements were sluggish from another night of interrupted sleep, but there was no regret in her tired smile. She made her way to the back room, switching on lights as she went. The makeshift nursery held steady warmth from the heating pad, and inside the box, Sprig stirred at her approach. Ruth blinked in surprise at what she saw. The tiny bobcat wasn't just awake, it was active. Sprig's paws pressed against the soft cloth lining, pushing with newfound strength. When Ruth reached down to check on it, she caught a glimpse of tiny teeth as Sprig opened its mouth in a silent mew. Those fragile legs that had barely moved days ago now kicked with purpose. Well, look who's feeling better, Ruth murmured, carefully. Checking Sprig's vitals, the improvement was noticeable even without measurements. Where before the kitten had barely responded to touch, now it actively sought out her hand. Across town at the high school, Luke sat in his math class, tapping his pencil against his notebook. The numbers on the board blurred as his mind wandered. To the morning's feeding, Sprig had taken the whole bottle for the first time, tiny paws batting at the plastic while drinking. He hadn't told anyone about their rescued bobcat. When his classmates talked about weekend plans or complained about chores, Luke stayed quiet, holding his secret close. Between classes, he checked his phone, not for social media or messages, but for the time, counting minutes until he could get home to check on Sprig. The final bell rang, and Luke was out of his seat before the sound faded. He hurried past groups of students planning after-school activities, ignoring calls from his usual gaming friends. His feet carried him home at nearly a run, backpack bouncing against his shoulders. The house was quiet when he arrived. Ruth still at the clinic with evening appointments. Luke dropped his bag and went straight to check on Sprig. The kitten was awake, making those tiny squeaking sounds that had become familiar over the past few days. Without thinking, Luke reached in to stroke its head with one finger, marveling at how the fur felt softer than before. Later that evening, Ruth showed him how to use the small digital scale she'd brought home from the clinic. You have to be very gentle, she explained, demonstrating how to place Sprig in the shallow dish. Keep one hand close in case it tries to move. Luke watched intently as numbers flickered on the display. Ruth jotted the weight in a small notepad. Where she'd been tracking Sprig's progress, the increase was tiny, mere grams, but it was there. That's good, right? Luke asked, trying to sound casual. Ruth nodded, her expression warm. Very good. Every gram counts at this stage. As darkness settled outside their windows, Luke sat cross-legged on the floor near Sprig's box. His school notebook lay open in his lap, but instead of homework, the page showed careful pencil strokes forming the shape of a tiny bobcat. He found himself adding details he'd noticed throughout the day, the exact curve of Sprig's ears, the pattern of spots beginning to show through its fur, the way its whiskers twitched while sleeping. Ruth walked past the doorway. pausing briefly when she noticed what he was drawing. Luke tensed, waiting for her to comment, but she simply continued on to the kitchen, leaving him to his artwork. Sprig stirred in its box, making those small sounds that Luke now recognized as a request for attention. He set his notebook aside and reached in, letting the kitten climb onto his open palm. Despite its newfound strength, Sprig was still small enough to fit comfortably in his hand. The Bobcat kitten turned in a wobbly circle, then settled into the warmth of Luke's palm. Its eyes drifted closed, tiny body relaxing into sleep with complete trust. Luke sat very still, watching the rise and fall of Sprig's breathing. Something shifted in his chest, an uncomfortable mix of emotions he wasn't ready to name. He wanted to pull his hand away to maintain the distance he'd been trying to keep. Instead, he found himself lifting his other hand to shield the sleeping kitten from a draft, his touch instinctively protective. Next day, the morning sun hadn't yet cleared. The horizon when Ruth began sorting supplies for her first rounds. The clinic was peaceful at this hour, with only the hum of heating vents and the occasional shuffle of animals in their kennels. She was checking inventory when the front door burst open with a bang. Luke stumbled in, still in his pajama pants, and a hastily thrown-on jacket. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear. In his trembling hands, he cradled Sprig, who lay motionless in a small blanket. "Mom," his voice cracked. "Something's wrong. Sprig won't eat, won't move. I tried the bottle but..." He held out the tiny form, his hands shaking so badly Ruth had to steady them with her own. Ruth's heart sank as she examined the limp kitten. Sprig's normally pink nose had taken on a bluish tinge, and its breathing was shallow and irregular. The tiny body felt cool to the touch, far too cool. "Quick," Ruth ordered, her professional calm masking her own worry. "Get to the break room. We need to warm some fluids." They rushed through the clinic's hallway, Luke's bare feet slapping against the linoleum. In the break room, Ruth grabbed her emergency kit while directing Luke to heat water on the small stove. "What's happening to Sprig?" Luke's voice was barely above a whisper. Ruth measured glucose powder into a solution with practiced hands. "Neonates baby animals can crash very quickly," she explained, keeping her voice steady despite the gravity of her next words. "Their systems are fragile. Sometimes, even with the best care, they just ... no." Luke's response was fierce. He cradled Sprig closer to his chest, using his own body heat. "We can't let that happen." Ruth watched her son's determined face as she prepared the warm fluids. She recognized that look. It was the same one she'd worn years ago, facing down similar odds with other rescued animals. "Start rubbing Sprig's body very gently," she instructed. "We need to stimulate blood flow." Luke sat at the break room table, carefully massaging Sprig's tiny limbs with one finger. Ruth worked quickly, preparing both the glucose solution and warming some formula. For the next several hours, they took turns administering drops of liquid, literally fighting for Sprig's life, one droplet at a time. The sun had fully risen, casting long shadows through the break room window when Sprig finally showed signs of improvement. First came a slight twitch of its paw, then a weak attempt to turn its head. Luke had been holding his breath without realizing it, and he let it out in a shaky exhale when Sprig finally gave a barely audible mewl. "That's it," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Come on, Sprig." Ruth watched as color slowly returned to Sprig's nose and paw pads. The kitten's breathing grew stronger, more regular. Still, Luke's hands trembled as he held the tiny body close, as if afraid Sprig might slip away if he loosened his grip even slightly. That evening, Luke refused to put Sprig back in the original shoebox. Instead, he gathered supplies from around the house: an old shoebox lid, pieces of soft fleece, and a small heating pad. With careful attention to detail, he constructed a new nest that would allow him to keep a closer watch on the kitten. He positioned everything on the floor next to his bed, adjusting the heating pad's temperature obsessively. Sprig, though weak, had managed to take 2 small feedings since their morning crisis. Now the kitten dozed fitfully, still requiring constant monitoring. Luke sprawled on the carpet beside the makeshift nest, one hand curved protectively around Sprig's tiny form. Despite his determination to stay awake, the emotional exhaustion of the day soon took its toll. His eyes grew heavy, and his head drooped to rest on his outstretched arm. Later that night, Ruth stopped by Luke's room to check on them. Made her pause in the doorway, her teenage son fast asleep on the floor, his face peaceful for the first time that day. Sprig was curled up in Luke's palm, rising and falling with each steady breath. Ruth stepped quietly into the room, draping a light blanket over Luke's shoulders. She studied their faces in the dim light. Her son's usually guarded expression softened in sleep, and the tiny fighter that had brought out his gentle side. "You're tougher than you look," she whispered to them both of you. The kitchen was unusually quiet the next morning. Luke pushed his cereal around in his bowl, dark circles under his eyes matching his mother's. The only sounds were the soft clink of spoons and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Ruth's coffee had gone cold, barely touched. "Collins was at the feed store yesterday," Ruth finally said, her voice carefully neutral. She stirred her coffee absently, not meeting Luke's eyes. He was asking about the Bobcat, wanted to know if I'd taken care of it. Luke's spoon clattered against his bowl, his shoulders tensed as he looked up sharply. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet," Ruth sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "But people talk in a small town. We can't keep Sprig hidden forever. But if Collins finds out—" Luke trailed off, his jaw tightening. The memory of yesterday's close call was still raw, making the threat feel even more real. At the clinic, later that morning, Ruth couldn't ignore the whispers anymore. She caught snippets of conversation that stopped abruptly when she entered rooms. The usually friendly atmosphere had grown thick with unspoken tension. Jenny, one of her longtime assistants, finally approached her during lunch break. "Ruth," she began hesitantly, "the supply cabinet's getting low, and I noticed Collins' usual delivery was smaller this week." Ruth nodded, keeping her face carefully blank. "We'll manage. It's just ... Jenny shifted uncomfortably. "Some of us. We're talking. Maybe it would have been more responsible to—" "You know, with the Bobcat," she wouldn't meet Ruth's eyes. "Resources are tight as it is." Ruth straightened, her voice firm but quiet. "Every life matters, Jenny, even the small ones." She turned back to her paperwork, effectively ending the conversation, but she could feel the tension simmering in the air like static. Before a storm, the afternoon dragged by with strained politeness and avoided glances. Ruth found herself checking her phone more often than usual, waiting for updates from Luke about SPRIG. Meanwhile, Luke had barely made it through his classes, constantly worrying about Sprig. The moment the final bell rang, he was out the door, ignoring calls from his friends about basketball practice. He took the shortcut home through Henderson's Field, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders as he jogged. When he burst through the front door, he heard a strange scratching sound from the living room. His heart jumped into his throat until he located the source. Sprig was actually standing, wobbling on unsteady legs like a newborn fawn. The tiny bobcat had managed to climb out of its nest and was attempting to explore. Its movements clumsy but determined. Luke watched, transfixed, as Sprig took a few tentative steps. The kitten's legs splayed out comically, and it tumbled forward, right into Luke's abandoned sneaker by the couch. The sight was so unexpected, so perfectly ridiculous, that Luke burst out laughing, his first real laugh in days, fumbling with his old flip phone. He managed to snap a picture just as Sprig poked its head out of the shoe, whiskers twitching inquisitively. The photo was grainy and slightly blurred, but Luke found himself staring at it, thumb hovering over the share button. After a moment, he simply saved it, tucking the memory away like a secret treasure. As evening settled in, Luke sat on the worn wooden steps of the front porch. The spring air was cooling, carrying the scent of newly turned earth from nearby fields. Sprig was nestled in the front pocket of his hoodie, just the top of its head visible, whiskers twitching at every new sound. Ruth's footsteps creaked on the boards behind him. She settled next to Luke, cradling a steaming mug of coffee between her hands. For a while, they just sat there, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. "He's not just surviving," Luke muttered, almost to himself, as he gently stroked Sprig's head with one finger. The words held more weight than their simplicity suggested, an acknowledgement of something deeper than just a kitten's struggle to live. Ruth took a slow sip of her coffee before responding. "So are we," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke sat cross-legged on the clinic's storage room floor, carefully holding the bottle at just the right angle as Sprig eagerly drank. The afternoon sun filtered through the small window, casting long shadows across boxes of medical supplies and stacks of old files. The familiar smell of antiseptic, mixed with the earthy scent of hay from nearby stalls. "That's it, buddy," Luke murmured, watching Sprig's tiny pink tongue work at the bottle's nipple. "Almost done." Footsteps echoed down the hallway, getting closer. Luke's heart jumped into his throat. In one fluid motion, he scooped Sprig up and tucked the kitten into an empty supply box, covering it with a soft towel. The door creaked open, spun around, ready to make excuses, but instead of his mother or clinic staff, he found himself staring at Ethan Collins. The younger boy stood awkwardly in the doorway, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, looking as startled as Luke felt. "What are you doing here?" Luke demanded, trying to keep his voice low while positioning himself between the box and the door. Ethan shuffled his feet, his face flushing. I heard Grandpa talking about a runt bobcat." He glanced nervously over his shoulder before continuing. "He was real mad about something Dr. Ruth did, or didn't do. So I kind of followed you after school." Luke's jaw clenched. "You can't tell anyone you saw me here. Is it true?" Ethan's eyes were wide with curiosity. "The bobcat, is it still alive?" "Grandpa said it was put down." Luke studied Ethan's face, searching for any sign of deception. After a long moment, he sighed and reached for the box. "If I show you, you have to swear not to tell anyone, especially your grandfather." Ethan nodded eagerly, stepping closer as Luke carefully lifted Sprig out. The kitten blinked at the newcomer, letting out a tiny squeak. "Oh!" Ethan breathed, his face lighting up. "It's so small." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill. "Here, it's my lunch money, for formula or whatever it needs." Luke stared at the offered money, taken aback by the gesture. "You don't have to, please." Ethan's voice was earnest. "I want to help. Can I hold it?" After a moment's hesitation. Luke nodded. "Sit down first," he instructed, demonstrating the proper way to support Sprig's body. "And be really careful." Ethan settled on the floor, holding his hands out like he was receiving something precious. Luke gently transferred Sprig into his waiting palms. The kitten immediately began exploring, tiny paws batting at a loose thread on Ethan's sleeve. "What's its name?" Ethan whispered, completely enchanted. "Sprig," Luke answered, watching as his unlikely ally handled the kitten with natural gentleness. "Because he's small but growing." They spent the next hour taking turns feeding and playing with Sprig, speaking in hushed voices about its progress. Ethan proved to be a quick learner, asking intelligent questions about feeding schedules and weight gain. When Ruth came to check on Luke, she found both boys huddled over a notebook, presumably doing homework, while Sprig dozed in its box nearby. If she noticed the new addition to their secret, she didn't mention it. "Would you like to stay for dinner, Ethan?" she asked instead, her voice warm. "We're having spaghetti." Ethan's face brightened. "Can I? I'll tell Grandpa I'm studying." During dinner, Ethan kept sneaking glances toward the living room, where Sprig rested. Ruth noticed how his hands, usually fidgety, according to his teachers, stayed gentle and steady when handling the kitten earlier. But she simply served seconds without comment, letting the boys maintain their careful conspiracy. After Ethan left, promising to return tomorrow, Luke helped clear the dishes. The kitchen was quiet, except for the running water and clinking plates. "If Collins finds out, we're done," Luke finally muttered. Drying a plate with more force than necessary, Ruth turned off the faucet, drying her hands on a dish towel. Then, "We better make sure he doesn't," she replied simply, her voice carrying both determination and caution. Early morning sunlight streamed through the dusty windows of Mason's Feed and Supply, catching motes of grain dust dancing in the air. The store smelled of sweet feed and leather, its wooden floors creaking under the weight of stacked bags and barrels. Collins stood at the counter, reviewing his monthly order with old Mason himself. And double the usual hay delivery, was saying when fragments of conversation drifted over from the seed aisle. Double quotes, Ruth's miracle bobcat, double quotes, tiny thing barely bigger than a mouse when it came in, growing stronger every day. I heard, Collins' pen stopped moving mid-signature. His weathered face hardened as he listened to the two women chattering, their voices carrying clearly in the quiet store. Thought that runt was put down weeks ago. One said, "No, my sister's friend works at the clinic, says Dr. Ruth's been keeping it alive. Even has her boy helping with night feedings." Mason cleared his throat awkwardly, noticing how Colin's knuckles had gone white around his pen. The farmer's expression darkened with each word, jaw clenching tight enough to make the muscles jump. Back at the clinic, Ruth stood in her office, staring at the donation box, where it usually overflowed with supplies, cat food, old blankets, even homemade treats. Now sat only a few meager offerings. Her shoulders slumped as she counted the items: 2 cans of generic cat food, a thin towel, and a half-empty bag of kibble. Luke appeared in the doorway, Sprig cradled in the crook of his arm. The kitten had grown enough to explore more, its fur filling out from downy fluff to proper coat. "Mom, you okay?" Ruth gestured at the box. "People are following Colin's lead. Our regular donors are staying away." She ran a hand through her graying hair. "I knew this might happen, but ... double quotes, but we were right," Luke interrupted firmly. He held up Sprig, who batted playfully at his chin. "Look at him. He's proof we made the right choice." The back door creaked open, and Ethan slipped in, checking over his shoulder before shutting it quietly. His backpack clinked as he set it down. "Brought these," he whispered, pulling out 3 cans of evaporated milk. "From our pantry. Grandpa would tan my hide if he knew, but ... double quotes, he shrugged, offering them to Ruth with careful hands. "Thank you, Ethan." Ruth accepted the cans, touched by his determination to help. "This will help stretch our formula supply." "Secret's safe," Luke promised, passing Sprig to Ethan, who immediately broke into a grin as the kitten climbed his shirt. That evening, after the clinic closed, the 3 of them gathered around the exam table. Ruth placed their old kitchen scale on the surface, wiping it clean with practiced movements. Luke held Sprig still while she took the measurement. 2 pounds, 3 ounces. Ruth announced, her tired face breaking into a genuine smile. "That's double his weight from when he arrived." "Really?" Ethan bounced on his toes, excitement making him forget to whisper, "Can I hold him again?" They passed Sprig between them, watching him prowl the table with growing confidence. When he pounced on Ruth's stethoscope, they all laughed, a warm, shared sound that filled the quiet clinic. For a moment, the worry about donations and disapproval faded away. They were just a family, celebrating their tiny triumph together. As dusk settled over the street, Luke walked Ethan to the clinic's front door. They were still smiling, planning tomorrow's feeding schedule, when Luke glanced outside. His smile vanished. Across the street, Colin stood beneath a flickering streetlight. His arms were crossed over his chest, his stance rigid as stone. Even in the growing darkness, Luke could feel the weight of his stare. Ethan hadn't noticed his grandfather yet, a gesture heavy with disappointment and something harder. Then the farmer turned away, disappearing into the evening shadows. Luke watched the empty street long after Collins had gone, his heart pounding against his ribs. Behind him, he could hear Sprig playing with a paper ball, oblivious to the storm. Gathering around its survival, the morning sun cast long shadows through the clinic windows as Ruth arranged her vaccination supplies on the metal exam table. But today, her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Mrs. Peterson sat in the waiting room with her ancient retriever, while the Thompsons waited, their turn with their new barn cat. The quiet murmur of conversation and the ticking of the wall clock filled the air with peaceful normalcy. In the back room, Luke crouched on a stool, carefully holding a bottle for Sprig. The Bobcat kitten had grown strong enough to grip the bottle with both paws, its spotted fur beginning to show proper markings. Luke smiled as Sprig's tiny tongue lapped eagerly at the formula. The clinic's front door crashed, open with such force that the bell nearly flew off its mount. Collins stood in the doorway, mud-caking his work boots, his face flushed dark red. Beneath his weathered tan, his presence seemed to suck all the air from the room. "Where is it?" he demanded, stomping toward the counter. "Where's that runt you said you'd put down?" Ruth straightened her back, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Collins, I have patients waiting. Don't dodge the question," Collins cut in, his voice rising. "The whole town's talking about your miracle, Bobcat. You lied to me, Ruth?" In the back room, Luke froze, mid-feeding. Luke held the kitten closer, hardly daring to breathe. "I made a professional judgment," Ruth said carefully, aware of her clients watching. The kitten showed signs of vitality. I believed it. Deserved a chance? A chance. Collins barked out a harsh laugh. You're wasting resources on a wild animal that nature already marked for culling. And Ethan slipped in, his face pale. He'd clearly run from school. He pressed himself against the wall, watching his grandfather's rage with wide eyes. This isn't just about one bobcat, Collins continued, his voice growing louder with each word. It's about responsibility, about making hard choices instead of following soft hearts into bankruptcy. Collins slammed his fist on the counter. The impact made everyone jump. Even Sprigg let out a startled squeak that Luke desperately tried to muffle in his hoodie. No more scraps from my farm to this clinic. He jabbed a finger at the other clients. And the rest of you better think carefully about enabling this kind of foolishness with your donations. The silence that followed his words felt like a physical weight. Ruth stood behind the counter, her face pale but her spine straight. Her hands had stopped shaking, though her eyes betrayed her shock. Luke emerged from the back room, Sprigg hidden safely in the pocket of his hoodie. His face was tight with anger, fists clenched at his sides. He moved to stand beside his mother, a silent show of support. Ethan remained pressed against the wall, his eyes fixed on the floor. The guilt on his face was plain to see. He looked torn between rushing to his grandfather's side and staying hidden. In the shadows, Collins turned on his heel and stormed out. The door slammed behind him, hard enough to rattle the windows. The heavy silence. The kitchen felt colder than usual that evening. Ruth and Luke sat at their small dinner table, the only sound coming from forks scraping against nearly empty plates. The refrigerator hummed in the background, its sparse contents a stark reminder of Collins' impact. A single bottle of milk, some eggs, and leftover casserole occupied the usually well-stocked shelves. Sprigg's feeding schedule card hung on the fridge door, a constant reminder of their current struggle. Luke stared at it, his jaw tightening with each bite of bland pasta. This is crazy, Luke finally burst out, dropping his fork with a clatter. We can barely feed ourselves, and we're spending money on special formula for a wild animal. Ruth set down her glass of water, her face tired but composed. Luke, no, Mom, everyone's turning against us. Collins is making sure of that. Luke pushed his chair back, gesturing at their meager dinner. Look at this. Is one bobcat really worth losing everything? Ruth folded her hands in her lap, studying her son's angry face. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. Sometimes the hardest fights are the ones we're told not to start. Luke opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. His mother's calm certainty made his anger feel somehow smaller. The next morning at school, Luke stood at his locker, pretending to sort through books while actually listening to a group of students nearby. My dad says Dr. Ruth's losing it, Sarah Matthews was saying. Bleeding money on some wildcat when she can barely keep her clinic running. Mom says it's irresponsible, added Tommy Peters, says we shouldn't take our horses there anymore. Luke's hands tightened on his textbook. He glanced over to see Ethan hovering nearby, clearly hearing everything. Their eyes met briefly before Ethan looked away, shoulders hunched with obvious discomfort. When the final bell rang, Luke found Ethan waiting by the bike rack. Come on, Luke said gruffly. Let's go check on him. The clinic was quiet when they arrived, Ruth busy with a client in the exam room. The bobcat kitten was alert, his spotted fur beginning to fill out nicely. His eyes, once cloudy with weakness, now tracked their movements with sharp interest. Luke carefully. The numbers ticked up, settling at a figure that made both boys lean in for a closer look. He's gained another 4 ounces, Luke announced, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. Ethan reached out to stroke Sprigg's head with one finger. The kitten leaned into his touch, purring softly. Yeah, Ethan said, then straightened up. He's worth it, Luke, no matter what Grandpa says. He is. Later that night, while Ruth worked on clinic paperwork, Luke sat cross-legged on his bed with his sketchbook open. His pencil moved. Gone was the fragile creature from his earlier drawings. This Sprigg had clear eyes and alert ears, his body filling out with proper kitten roundness. When he finished, Luke studied the drawing for a long moment. Then he tore it carefully from the notebook and padded downstairs to the kitchen. The refrigerator door was covered with old shopping lists and appointment reminders. Luke found a magnet and pinned his drawing right in the center. The next morning, Ruth paused on her way to grab breakfast. Her eyes fell on the new addition to the fridge. Sprig's portrait, every line drawn with obvious care and attention. A small smile lifted the corners of her mouth as she touched the corner of the paper gently. Feeling renewed strength flow through her tired bones, Luke's fingers trembled as he held the bottle near Sprig's mouth. The tiny bobcat lay in his makeshift nest, sides heaving with labored breaths. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Come on, buddy," Luke whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just a few drops." But Sprig turned his head away from the bottle, a concerning wheeze escaping with each breath. The clock on the wall read 11:43 p.m., its ticking seeming to grow louder as panic crept up Luke's spine. He touched Sprig's small body gently. It felt too warm, even through the fur. The kitten's usually bright eyes were dull, half-closed. Heart hammered against his ribs as he scrambled to his feet. "Mom!" he called out, his voice cracking. "Mom, wake up!" He heard Ruth's bedroom door open, followed by quick footsteps. She appeared in the doorway, hair disheveled from sleep, but eyes alert. "He won't eat," Luke explained, words tumbling out, "and his breathing's all wrong." Ruth knelt beside the nest, her veterinarian's hands moving with practiced care as she examined Sprig. Her frown deepened. "We need to get him to the clinic, now." The drive seemed endless, though it was barely 10 minutes. Luke cradled Sprig's box on his lap, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed. The streets were empty, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside the clinic, Ruth moved with urgent efficiency. She pulled out their remaining incubator, one of the few pieces of equipment they had left after Colin's influence had driven away so many donors. The machine hummed to life, its warming light casting a soft glow across the treatment room. "What's happening to him?" Luke asked, watching Ruth check Sprig's vital signs. "Could be an infection," she replied, her voice tense with concentration. "Or maybe a digestive blockage. Both are common in wild runts." She pressed a stethoscope to Sprig's chest, his heart rates elevated. A soft tap at the back door made them both jump. Ruth peered through the window, then quickly opened it. Ethan slipped inside, still in his pajamas, with a jacket thrown hastily over them. "I saw your car," he explained breathlessly. "Is Sprig okay?" "We're working on it," Ruth answered, already moving back to the incubator. "Luke, I need you to hold him still while I start fluids." Luke carefully positioned his hands around Sprig's tiny body. The kitten felt impossibly fragile beneath his fingers. Ethan moved closer, offering to help. Here, Ruth guided Ethan's hands. "Keep his head steady, just like that." They worked together as the hours crawled by. Ruth improvised with what supplies they had left, making do with adapted equipment and careful monitoring. Luke found himself whispering prayers under his breath, something he hadn't done since his father left. "Please," he murmured, not sure who he was talking to. "Please let him make it." Ethan's presence was a quiet comfort, his determination matching Luke's own. Neither boy spoke much, but their shared worry filled the room. Ruth moved between them, checking vital signs, adjusting fluids, her movements growing more tired but never less precise. The wall clock ticked past 2 a.m., then 3 a.m. Outside, the world was silent except for the occasional passing car. Inside, they waited, watched, and hoped. Just before dawn, when the sky was beginning to lighten to a pale gray, Luke felt it, a small movement against his palm. Sprig's claws flexed weakly, catching against his skin. The kitten's breathing had eased, becoming more regular, Mom, Luke called softly. "Look." Ruth leaned in, checking vitals one more time. A smile broke across her tired face. "That's our fighter," she whispered. Relief flooded through the room like a physical thing. Luke's legs felt suddenly weak, and he dropped into a nearby chair. Ethan slumped against the wall, sliding down to sit on the floor. Ruth checked Sprig one final time before sinking into her own chair. "This little one's teaching us all how to fight," she said quietly. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sunrise paint the room in soft golden light. In the incubator, Sprig's breathing continued steady and strong, his small body illuminated by the warming glow. A week after Sprig's health scare, sunlight streamed through the clinic's back window, casting warm patches on the examination table. Luke sat cross-legged on a stool, his phone held steady as he recorded Sprig's wobbly progress across a clean white towel. "Look at him go," Luke murmured, zooming in as the small bobcat batted at a feather dangling from a string. Sprig's movements were still clumsy, but his strength showed in every determined step. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching with a small smile. "He's getting pretty active," he observed. "You know, the town fair's coming up next weekend. They're having that 4-H showcase like they do every year." Luke lowered his phone, glancing at his friend. "What about it?" "Well," Ethan shuffled his feet. "Maybe we could enter Sprig, show everyone he made it, that he was worth saving." Ruth, who had been sorting supplies nearby, paused, her hand stilled on the cabinet door. "The fair, Maza?" she asked quietly. "Your grandfather will be there, Ethan. He's on the agriculture committee." "I know," Ethan admitted, "but maybe that's exactly why we should do it. Show him he was wrong." Luke's eyes lit up with possibility, but Ruth's face remained troubled. She moved to the examination table, gently stroking Sprig's fur. "It's not that simple. Collins has a lot of influence in this town, but that's exactly why we have to do it," Luke insisted, standing up. "Everyone's been listening to his side. Maybe it's time they heard ours." The next day at school, Luke and Ethan commandeered a corner of the art room during lunch. They spread out a large poster board, carefully arranging their evidence of Sprig's journey. Luke's phone photos showed the progression from weak newborn to active kitten. The weight log documented every hard-won ounce. "This one should go in the center," Ethan said. Pointing to Luke's detailed sketch from the fridge, the one that showed Sprig's determined eyes and growing strength, their science teacher, Mrs. Martinez, stopped by as they worked. She studied their layout with interest. "This is quite a story you're telling," she observed. "We're showing it at the fair," Luke explained, then added more quietly, "Some people think we should have given up on him." Mrs. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "No, truth has its own kind of power. Sometimes all we need to do is show it clearly and let it speak for itself." Back at the clinic that afternoon, Ruth helped them prepare for the showcase. She pulled out a small carrier, lining it with soft towels and checking the ventilation. Carefully, her movements were precise, but Luke could see the worry in her eyes. "Mom," he said, "we have to do this. You always say standing up for what's right matters." Ruth set down the carrier and turned to face him. Her expression was serious but gentle. "I can't protect you from what Collins will say," she admitted, "but I can stand beside you." Luke nodded, something tight in his chest loosening at her words. Together, they finished preparing the carrier, making sure it would keep Sprig secure and comfortable during the fair. That night, Luke placed the carrier next to his bed. Sprig was already inside, curled up on his favorite towel, one paw tucked under his chin. His eyes were half closed, peaceful despite tomorrow's challenge. "Tomorrow, we show them all," Luke whispered, watching Sprig's steady breathing until his own eyes grew heavy. The moonlight filtered through his window, casting silver shadows across the carrier. Inside, Sprig slept on, his small form a testament to survival against the odds. As Luke drifted off beside him, Luke woke to soft pinks and golds in the sky. Immediately checking on Sprig, the bobcat watched him alertly, showing none of his former weakness. "Ready for your big day?" Luke whispered, grabbing the carrier and supply bag they'd packed in the kitchen. Ruth handed him toast, her movements betraying nervousness despite her calm face. "Eat something. It'll be a long morning." Their drive was quiet, except for Sprig's occasional mews. Ethan sat with his poster board as other vehicles headed toward the fairgrounds. The parking lot was half full, filled with scents of fried dough and hay. Children darted between stalls with animals, and displays as banners announced the 4-H showcase. Inside the exhibition tent, Luke and Ethan set up their display, showing Sprig's journey from barely surviving to thriving. People gathered, drawn by the unusual bobcat among domestic animals. "Is that the miracle cat?" visitors whispered, faces showing both approval and skepticism. As the crowd built, Collins appeared, his face hard. Nearby conversations hushed. "This is where all the wasted effort went," he announced loudly, eyeing the carrier. "All this time spent on one worthless runt." Before Luke could respond, Ethan stepped forward, trembling but "I helped them," he confessed to his startled grandfather. "It wasn't waste. I saw life. I watched him fight to survive." Collins stared in shock as Luke joined Ethan, his voice strengthening. "When my dad left, I thought some things were too broken to save." But Sprig taught me different. He wasn't just being saved, he was saving me, too. Sprig mewed loudly, batting at his carrier door as the crowd burst into applause. Collins stood frozen, his certainty crumbling. He turned and walked away as people continued clapping, some wiping tears. Ruth squeezed Luke's shoulder as he exhaled. He'd said what needed saying. Everyone now knew the truth about their miracle cat. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm patches across the worn linoleum floor. The familiar scent of coffee filled the air as Ruth stood at the counter watching the old percolator bubble and hiss. Behind her, Luke sat at the kitchen table, Sprig curled contentedly in his lap. His fingers moved gently over the Bobcat's head, tracing the pattern that had become so familiar over the past weeks. The screen door creaked, and Ethan stepped in, holding a large bag of feed. His cheeks were flushed, either from the morning chill or embarrassment. "Morning," he said softly, setting the bag down carefully. "Grandfather, ... he sent this." He shifted his weight from foot to foot before adding, he said, "Maybe it's time I help here, officially." Like regular volunteer work, Ruth turned from the coffee maker, surprise evident on her face. Luke looked up too, his hand pausing mid-stroke on Sprig's fur. "He did?" Ruth asked, her voice gentle. Ethan nodded, gaining confidence. He said, "Well," he said, "sometimes the best lessons come from being proved wrong." The morning at the clinic started quietly, but soon the bell above the door began chiming regularly. People trickled in, not just with their usual appointments, but carrying donations. Mrs. Henderson from the garden shop brought 3 bags of fresh hay. The Cooper twins lugged in a box of gently used blankets. Even old Mr. Jenkins, who rarely left his farm, showed up with 2 large bags of feed. "Saw that display at the fair," he mumbled, not quite meeting Ruth's eyes. "Got me thinking about my own runt calf from last spring. Sometimes the small ones surprise you." Ruth accepted each donation with misty eyes, her thank you growing more emotional each time. Luke and Ethan helped store everything, their arms full of supplies that would keep the clinic running for weeks. Between visitors, Ruth sat down with Luke and Ethan to discuss Sprig's future. The Bobcat was thriving now, but still too small and dependent for release into the wild. She'd arranged for him to go to the Blue Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, where he'd be safe and properly prepared for eventual release. Luke nodded silently, his jaw tight. He understood, had always known this day would come, but understanding didn't make it easier. While Ruth filled out the transfer paperwork, he retreated to the break room with his sketchbook. After a few minutes, he carefully tore out his best drawing of Sprig, the one that showed the Bobcat alert and strong, so different from those first desperate days. When it was time to leave, Luke tucked the drawing into Sprig's carrier, positioning it where the sanctuary staff would find it, so they'll know his story, he explained quietly, when Ruth raised an eyebrow. The drive to the sanctuary took them through a familiar countryside, past Collins' farm and beyond. The setting sun painted the sky in deep oranges and purples, casting long shadows across the fields. Sprig remained unusually quiet in his carrier, as if sensing the importance of the journey. At the sanctuary's drop-off point, Luke asked for one last moment. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the carrier door. Sprig looked up at him with bright eyes, so different from the barely breathing kitten they'd first rescued. "Keep fighting?" Luke whispered, his voice rough with emotion. He held out his finger, and Sprig pressed against it one final time, a gentle nuzzle of farewell. The sanctuary staff were kind but efficient, gathering Sprig's carrier and paperwork. They promised to send updates and praised the obvious care he'd received. Luke stood very still, watching until they disappeared inside with their precious cargo. The drive home was quiet, but not with the tense silence that had filled the truck so many times before. This was a peaceful, quiet, full of completion rather than loss. Ruth glanced in the rearview mirror at Luke, noting how he sat straighter now, his shoulders set with a new confidence. He clutched his sketchbook to his chest, watching the sunset paint the passing fields in gold. Ruth felt a wave of pride and understanding wash over her as she drove. The runt wasn't the only one who learned how to survive. I believe stories like this find us for a reason. If this one touched you, please subscribe. I share a new one every day, and tomorrow's might be the one your heart's been waiting for.